Hello again, my dear devoted listeners, and welcome to Tierah Ruins Things with Science, my podcast about the science of infectious diseases in pop culture. I am Tierah, here eagerly waiting to ruin more of your favorite TV shows and movies by telling you how badly they butchered reality. Today's episode is about the most prolific killer in infectious disease history, tuberculosis, as shown in the movie Tombstone. I hadn't watched this show before I chose it for this episode, and I actually chose it because of that, because there were several other options I could have picked to focus on, but I've seen them already. Tuberculosis is shown in Les Miserables also. Fantine catches TB after being fired from her job at the factory for having a daughter. And in Moulin Rouge also, where Satine, played by Nicole Kidman, has consumption. There's one more. It's also portrayed in Heavenly Creatures, Peter Jackson's sapphic romance film from 1994, starring Kate Winslet and Melanie Lynskey in their mutual on-screen debuts. Anyways, I called this episode Tombstone, but I actually watched the other 3 movies too, and they're all available to rent or stream on all the regular services. So let's dive in.
Your condition's quite advanced. I'd say you lost some 60% of your lung tissue, maybe more.
Approximately 25% of the entire population of the world is infected with tuberculosis, according to the WHO. That's current. That's today, not 100 years ago. Out of 8.2 billion people on the planet, that's over 2 billion people infected. There is no other infection or disease or condition that we have allowed to get to this horrifying level of prevalence. TB has been the leading cause of death throughout recorded history, except for 3 years when COVID-19 was in the lead. It is the leading cause of death in people living with HIV and is a major cause of death due to antibiotic resistance. In 2023, almost 11 million new people became infected with TB, 5 to 10% of whom will go on to develop active disease at some point in their life, and 1.25 million people died from it. For an infection that is curable and preventable, this is outrageous. The only reason why this isn't a bigger deal is because tuberculosis is no longer seen as the chic condition consumption that affects the tortured poets or creative artists and confers some sort of glowy, pale, long-suffering burden, but as a disease of poverty, punishment, and people of color. All of the movies for this episode aren't really about tuberculosis in the same way that everything else this season has been, about the specific thing. TB in these shows is used more of like a set dressing, essentially, in a similar way that I mentioned smallpox was used in the last episode. In Moulin Rouge and Les Mis, it's used as plot points to move the story forward or enhance a tragic love story, whereas in Tombstone and Heavenly Creatures, it's mentioned because it's historical fact. But the main point of the movies are the stories they're telling. Because of that, I'm going to skip over the details of the specific movie plot points like I've done for all the other episodes where I go through them all. I do mention it where I can, and I will talk about the accuracy, of course, but I'm going to spend the bulk of this episode telling you the story of the disease and how it was discovered and eventually treated. Since the discovery of the tuberculosis bacterium in 1882, over 1 billion people have died from it. There have been other claims that malaria is the biggest killer in history. Some say smallpox or the plague. All of those are definitely up there in the top 10, maybe even the top 5. An oft-quoted stat about malaria is that it has killed half of everyone who has ever lived, which would be about 27 billion people. But that's likely an overestimation or a misunderstanding of an article that said half of everyone who's ever lived has been at risk of malaria. Malaria reached its peak of prevalence in the late 1800s, though, and has gone down in incidence from there, even though it is still responsible for about 600,000 deaths per year. TB is over twice that currently, and in the past was much more than twice that figure. Smallpox killed between 300 to 500 million people between 1900 and its eradication in 1980, so it will no longer be going up the list of accumulated deaths, only down. Earlier than that, it's hard to say how many smallpox got for sure, probably another couple hundred million over the last 10,000 years. And plague killed a couple hundred million during the Black Death and other pandemics, but it's currently very low in incidence and only a few thousand cases happen a year and maybe a couple hundred deaths worldwide. The bacterial genus Mycobacterium has been around for millions of years, and the direct ancestors of modern Mycobacterium tuberculosis probably appeared around 20,000 years ago. The oldest confirmed evidence we have of tuberculosis is about 17,000 years old, and it's in the bones of a long-horned bison that was enclosed in sediments in the natural trap cave in Wyoming. In humans, the earliest skeletons with changes that we know are from tuberculosis date to 8,000 to 10,000 years ago. They're from Syria, so that's near the Near East Fertile Crescent area. Those skeletal changes are necrotic lesions with no evidence of new bone formation in the long bones. We can tell there's joint stiffness, or which is called ankylosis, localized to the hips, knees, and wrists. There's new bone formation on the surface of the ribs, clubbing of the fingers and toes, and then there are big changes to the spine, including stiffness and kyphosis, which is a hunched back that is better known as Pott's disease. Now, whether or not hunched backs throughout history were all caused by tuberculosis or scoliosis or even Proteus syndrome is not for me to judge here, but it's possible in some cases. A figure like Quasimodo from the Hunchback of Notre Dame was probably almost certainly not meant to be Pott's disease. However, Tiny Tim from A Christmas Carol is probably Pott's disease caused by spinal tuberculosis. Tiny Tim's family, the Cratchits, were living in crowded conditions in London. They were very poor and they did not have good nutrition. Tiny Tim walked with a crutch and is depicted in the definitive on-screen adaptation of the Dickens work, A Muppet Christmas Carol, as coughing and being very weak.
The goose! No, now, son, now you've gotten too excited.
Considering tuberculosis was killing about 60,000 people a year in industrial centers like London around the time that A Christmas Carol was written in 1843, and that Pott's disease was seen as a typical plight of the poorer classes, I think it's reasonable to agree that Tiny Tim is shown as suffering from Pott's disease as an emblem of the ravages of the dispassionate and cruel environment of city living and poverty at the time. In any case, we do have evidence that tuberculosis of the spine leading to a hunched back is true for some skeletons that we have found in Syria, Jordan, and also Egypt, and other places in Africa and China spanning the last 10,000 years. The numbers of cases are not large. These bone changes only happen in less than 5% of modern patients, and then even fewer of those would have been preserved enough for us to find the evidence, so it's likely that TB was quite widespread. So common, in fact, that when Hippocrates published his aphorisms in 400 BCE, he included one about spinal tuberculosis that says, "Such persons as become humped back from asthma or cough before puberty die." In the Greek and Roman world, tuberculosis was known as phthisis, that's PHTH, isis, and the standard treatment at the time was milk, better nutrition, and moving to northern Africa. Aretaeus of Cappadocia, who was a Greek physician living in Rome, recommended phthisis patients go to high altitudes, travel by sea, eat a good diet, and get plenty of milk. Galen, the most famous physician of the Roman Empire, also recommended fresh air, milk, and sea voyages. During the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, physicians and records of the time seemed to almost ignore tuberculosis, or they weren't mentioning it much, because the bigger concerns of the day were leprosy, which is caused by tuberculosis cousin Mycobacterium leprae, and then plague and syphilis. Another common presentation of tuberculosis at the time outside of Pott's disease was called scrofula, which was known as the king's evil. Scrofula is a swelling of the cervical lymph nodes. Those are the ones under your chin and around your neck, and it was widely believed at the time that it could be cured by the royal touch. Scrofula is a presentation that can sometimes go into remission on its own, so it gave the impression that it was cured. If you weren't lucky enough to get a royal audience, then physicians at the time would try to remove the swollen glands through a risky, non-sterile surgery, or they would apply poultices of pig bile or figs. Figs, surprisingly enough, do seem to have some antibacterial properties against species like Klebsiella pneumoniae, as well as E. coli, Staph aureus, and Pseudomonas aeruginosa, so they may not have been that far off there. Pig bile does fuck all, though. By the 17 and 1800s, medicine had added bloodletting and leeches to the mix, but the mainstay treatment remained the same as in Roman times: rest, milk, and altitude or sea voyages. As the Italian saying went, lana, letto, latte, which means wool, bed, and milk. Around the 1820s to 1830s, we have a ton of new treatments coming in. This is the time period that Les Miserables is set. That movie took place from 1815 to 1832. Treatments common then were cod liver oil, and, I'm not sure if that is taken orally or put on the skin, but maybe on the skin, because also common were chest massages with a tincture of vinegar and cantharidin. Cantharidin is a fun thing. It's a clear, odorless, sticky, fatty substance that is secreted by male blister beetles, and he gives it to the female as a postcoital copulation gift so that she can cover her fertilized eggs with it to defend them against predators. That's because it's poisonous and causes skin burns, so if you combine that with vinegar, you're not going to have much skin left, and it's not going to be a fun time. If you didn't want that, you could always go for the pills that were made of copper sulfate, morphine, and creosote. If pills were hard to come by, you could try inhaling the vapors of tar, iodine, chlorine, hemlock, turpentine, hydrogen cyanide, hydroiodate of potassium, and other stimulants or sedatives, I guess, depending on the time of day. You got to get your uppers and your downers in the right spot. Those treatments were in the UK and northern continental Europe, but if you lived in Italy and southern Europe, you'd be recommended to try swallowing a concoction of Iceland and Irish moss, extract of aconite, seed of water dropwort, sulfur, calcium hydroxide, and pine tar water. You should also try covering your body with myrrh tincture, ointment of emetic tartar. Emetic means it's going to make you vomit, and leaves of belladonna in an opioid infusion. So, people in the 1800s were getting fucked up on tuberculosis treatments. And all of it utterly failed to do anything helpful to treat the tuberculosis. So much so that renowned British doctor James Clark said, "Respecting the treatment of consumption, we must admit the humiliating truth that there is no reason to believe the physicians of the present day more successful than their predecessors were 10 or 20 centuries ago."
Unfortunately, the miracles of modern medicine can only go so far in combating an illness like TB.
In the pre-germ theory era, tuberculosis was present in every population and social class. It was not limited to either the poor or the rich. Multiple monarchs died of it, including Anne Neville, who was Queen of England in the 1480s, as well as Henry VII and Edward VI of England, Madeleine of Valois, Queen of Scotland, Charles IX of France, and also George Canning, who was a UK Prime Minister, and James Monroe, the 5th US President. Many other influential and well-known figures had it too, like John Keats, the poet, Elizabeth Barrett Browning, the whole Bronte family, Frederick Chopin, Lord Byron, and Eleanor Roosevelt, the wife of FDR, who we met in episode 4 about polio. More recently, George Orwell, Tina Turner, Ringo Starr, and Nelson Mandela have all had tuberculosis, although none of them died from it. But also Jane Austen, John Calvin, and Andrew Jackson all likely had TB, while Robbie Burns, Albert Camus, Anton Chekhov, Franz Kafka, and Vivian Leigh did die of tuberculosis. As did Doc Holliday from Tombstone, who, along with all the other characters in that movie, was a real historical figure. During the Romance period of the late 1700s and the first half of the 1800s, they romanticized everything, including tuberculosis. Suffering from consumption was a beautiful and dramatic way to die. The popular myth was that tuberculosis was more drawn to the creative types, that the infection conferred enlightenment and beauty, and that this trait and tuberculosis itself could be passed down genetically. This thought was around even before the Romance period, as Greek physicians spoke of spes phthisica, a euphoria mixed with depression that brought on greater creativity and elevated the work of artists. The consumptive physique and symptoms of the disease were seen as chic and fashionable. The frequent fevers led to sparkling or dilated eyes, rosy cheeks, and red lips, which were then emulated through the makeup routines of the day, and still today. Powders and creams were used to create a pale skin to mimic the consumptive complexion, which idealized not only white beauty, but the idea of women being fragile and weak. With tuberculosis, you lose your appetite, so people often lost a ton of weight and looked gaunt. But this also allowed women to fit into the restrictive corsets and narrow waists of the day without feeling the hunger of starving themselves, so it was seen as a blessing and desirable. They did not have Ozempic back then, so tuberculosis was the next best thing. The thin, weak physical appearance and shortness of breath due to damaged lungs created the beautiful doomed woman trope that was present in a lot of the popular literature and art from that time, including in the movies I watched for this, Moulin Rouge and Les Mis. In Moulin Rouge, the classic coughing into a bloody handkerchief, which indicates impending death as a trope, that's practically textbook in the case of Satine. Fantine in Les Mis, she also suffers from TB and dies of it rather quickly, highlighting the desperate plight of the poor people living in post-revolution France. Of course, in 1882, when the cause of tuberculosis was identified, all of a sudden it wasn't chic anymore because then people knew it was just a common disease that dirty people spread, not something unavoidable that hit you because you were rich, attractive, and white. Based on the ancient Roman recommendation of rest in altitude, and knowing that 1800s medicine was doing fuck all to help people, the first sanatorium was established in 1854 by Hermann Bremer of Gorbersdorf, and I apologize for the hate crime of my pronunciation, but that place, however you say it, is in the Silesian Mountains in current modern-day Poland. Bremer's initial thought was that an active life at high altitude would restore health, but he quickly changed that to massive amounts of rest, mostly outdoors in airy conditions, and mild exercise and a healthy diet. 2 years later, in 1856, Henri Clermont-Lombard published a study on the effects of mountain climate, claiming that the low oxygen at high altitude would induce a sort of respiratory diet, preventing tuberculosis from progressing. People believed him and believed in sanatoria because TB was rare in people living at altitudes. Now, I'm going to go out on a limb and say that while this might be true, I'm not going to spend 3 days looking those stats up, but if it is, it's probably only because there's fewer people living at high altitudes. There's less dense population, so there's less chance for it to spread. Not that the people who live up there or the altitude engenders an immunity to tuberculosis. There are real benefits to being in a sanatorium, though, as resting and being outside was considered heliotherapy. It's basically sunbathing, and this provided vitamin D, and the healthy diet filled in the other nutritional deficiencies. The simplest intervention of bed rest turns out to actually be reasonably effective, and not just from, the rest part of it. When you lie down horizontal, gravity would no longer pull your blood lower in your body and lungs, meaning there was even more oxygen and lymph flow to the upper parts of your lungs, which is where most people develop their tubercular lesions, and so this made it harder for the bacteria to grow. This is probably partly due to the more even oxygen pressure, but also to more circulation of white blood cells. But whatever it was, it did seem to have a slight positive effect. The first American sanatorium was established in 1875 by a Bavarian, Josef Gleitzman, in Asheville, North Carolina, and then 9 years later, in 1884, the Adirondack Cottage Sanatorium was established at Saranac Lake in upstate New York by Dr. Edward Livingston Trudeau. This became the best-known sanatorium in the U.S. and is the place where Adirondack patio chairs came from because they were invented for tuberculosis patients to recline on outside. Dr. Trudeau had TB himself, and he became a major figure in public health for his fight against it. And this is the time period when Tombstone and Moulin Rouge take place. Tombstone is in the early 1800s through 1887, and Moulin Rouge is 1899 to 1900. By 1904, there were 115 sanatoria in the U.S. with about 8,000 beds. By 1923, there were 656, and in 1953, at their peak, there were 839 institutions with over 136,000 beds functioning. They were everywhere, particularly throughout the American West and Southwest, as doctors were actively encouraging people to move west to the mountains and to drier climates to help their lungs. This is how Doc Holliday ended up in Arizona and Tombstone, and then eventually in Colorado, where he died in a hospital. Other than rest and sunbathing, surgeons at sanatoria would also occasionally create an artificial pneumothorax, which means they'd intentionally collapse one of your lungs. If you hurt yourself anywhere else on your body, you'd need to rest that part while it heals, right? Well, why should that not work for lungs, they thought. Surgeons thought that if they collapsed your lung, it would have time to rest and recover, but despite much evidence that this was practiced, among other surgical inventions like sometimes removing parts of the lung altogether, there's no evidence of testing to see whether it actually helped. I imagine it was also horrifically painful and uncomfortable for the people who endured it. All of these treatments, from the days of pills and poultices to sanatorium stays and surgeries, they were the privilege for the rich. None of this was cheap or provided for free, so only the rich and upper classes could afford to get treated, at least at first. The poor and less well off had to suffer through and die from it because even if they could have theoretically afforded the cost of the treatment, and even when publicly funded and charity ran sanatoria were established, they couldn't afford to take months to years off work. This is why Satine and Fantine both suffer and die horribly with no possibility of treatment, because they couldn't afford it. Once the true cause was discovered, when actual research was done into treatments, and when the antibiotic era finally dawned, the upper classes and people who could afford treatments were cured, and the infection was left to the poor and underprivileged, where it remains today.
I've got scars. They're on my lungs. I spent months in bed during the war, ravaged by respiratory illness.
Most tuberculosis infections start when you inhale droplets that another person with active TB has coughed out. Rarely you can get TB from touching something that a person has coughed on, say like a handkerchief or tissue, but only then if you touch it and you've got broken skin. Also rarely, at least for now, is catching it from drinking raw milk. This used to be one of the main ways it was transmitted, along with a host of other diseases, and I will revisit this in a bit when I talk about Louis Pasteur and Robert Koch and the beef that they had with each other. Pun intended. Tuberculosis is not spread by shaking hands with someone. It is not spread by sharing food or drink with them. Even sharing a toothbrush or kissing them does not spread it. If whatever it is doesn't involve you inhaling the cough droplets of someone with active TB, caveat open wounds, it will not spread tuberculosis. When you inhale the droplets, if they all get caught in the upper airway passages and none make it down to the alveoli, you'll most likely be able to eliminate all the bacteria, or they'll persist in a dormant state and you'll be one of those 2 billion people infected latently with tuberculosis. When you are infected, and you're not one of the lucky ones that eliminates the bacteria, you won't notice right away. Remember, it can take months to years to start showing symptoms. You will probably notice a persistent cough at first. As that progresses, you'll experience chest pain and tightness, fever, night sweats, fatigue, and weight loss due to lack of appetite, and then eventually you'll start coughing up blood. All of our movies got this pretty accurate, although Fantine and Les Mis, I know that movie sped through time pretty quickly and there were lots of time jumps, but she seemed to get sick and die within a few months to a year, so that is a little fast for TB. Tombstone and Moulin Rouge start with our affected characters already sick and well into showing symptoms and coughing up blood, while in Heavenly Creatures, Juliet was sick as a child and then her TB reactivates later in life. From there, your symptoms depend on what other organs the bacteria have spread to. As it spreads out and around the lungs, it'll get hard to breathe on top of coughing because you'll be developing scar tissue on your lungs and in the pleural space, which is the fluid-filled membrane area layer place that separates your lungs from your abdominal cavity, and this lets your lungs move and expand without you feeling the friction. If TB gets into your lymphatic system and your lymph nodes, they will become swollen as in scrofula. Blood in the urine indicates TB of the kidneys. A gravelly or hoarse-sounding voice means it's in your larynx. And back pain or other bone and joint pain indicates that it's in your bones and cartilage. You'll be losing weight dramatically because you just won't want to eat, and you'll be very tired and exhausted all the time anyways. This is why the disease was originally called consumption, because your body wasted away like it was being consumed from the inside out. This was happening on a very large scale. Between 1851 and 1910, 4 million people across just England and Wales died from it. In 1861, Oliver Wendell Holmes, an American physician, called tuberculosis the White Plague. This probably didn't refer directly to skin color, although it was referring to the paleness that was made more obvious by white skin, but also it could have referred to the innocence and air of noble holiness that it was ascribed to people with TB. Although that suggestion was originally made in the 90s, and I'm not entirely convinced that it isn't a way of sanitizing the uncomfortable history of the glorification of pale skin by offering what seems on the surface to be a logical alternate explanation, but that willfully ignores the wider context. However, this does make me want to mention that on this show, I am not intentionally avoiding describing what TB was doing to places other than Europe and North America. I am focusing on those countries because that's where the movies that I watched for this episode are set, other than Heavenly Creatures, which is in New Zealand. It is safe to assume that tuberculosis was doing much the same to all countries at the time, however, that is no longer the case. John Green recently published a book called Everything is Tuberculosis, and if you want to read some harrowing first-hand accounts of what TB is like today amongst low-income people, please do read that book. It's an amazing read, it is not long, and I hope it will make you very, very mad like it did me.
Monsieur Ziedler, Mademoiselle Zettine is dying. She has consumption.
The first idea that tuberculosis could be a contagious illness was made in 1722 when English physician Benjamin Martin suggested that the breath of a consumptive could be caught by a sound person. He was, of course, entirely ignored and ridiculed, as was the custom of the time, when anyone suggested something that went against what everyone else believed. The first actual demonstration of TB being contagious didn't happen for over 140 more years until 1865, which was, coincidentally, the same year that Ignaz Semmelweis was committed to an asylum for suggesting that surgeons should wash their hands in between performing an autopsy and attending someone giving birth. This proof of contagion was done by Jean-Antoine Villemin, who transferred pus and fluid from both humans and cows to rabbits, who then developed tuberculosis. This was also completely ignored by Villemin's contemporaries, which is weird because Friedrich Henle, who was a professor of anatomy, had published in 1840 that he thought infectious diseases were caused by living organisms. Big paradigm changes like this, though, they can take decades or centuries to happen and be fully accepted. And that is how we ended up with Robert Koch. Koch was a German doctor who happened to live in an area where anthrax was rampant, and Koch was one of many trying to find the cause. The bacteria Bacillus anthracis had previously been identified by a different group of researchers, but no one had yet proven that it caused anthrax, the disease. Now, I don't know if anyone outside of microbiology will know what Koch's postulates are, but they are the very first thing you learn on day one in your introductory microbiology or immunology course. Koch's postulates are the backbone of the study of infectious diseases, and he developed them through his studies on anthrax and tuberculosis. I'm going to skip the very long story of how he did that and tell you what they are. If you want to show that a certain disease is caused by a certain microorganism, 1. The organism must be present in the diseased tissue. 2. The organism must be isolated and grown in pure culture. 3. The pure culture must induce the same disease experimentally in a new subject. And 4. The organism should then be re-isolated from the experimentally infected subject. If you remember in episode 2 about the 1918 influenza, I said that Richard Pfeiffer and Shibasaburo Kitasato had been working with Koch in 1892 to find the cause of influenza, and they had isolated a bacterium that we now call Haemophilus influenzae. They were trying to prove that it caused influenza, but these postulates were showing them that they were wrong. They isolated the bacterium from people with the flu, they grew it in pure culture, and they reinfected a new subject, but it did not cause the same disease, so they were unable to support their hypothesis, and then they kept looking for the real cause. There, the postulates worked as intended. However, there are many times when they do not. There are a lot of bacterial species that are incredibly hard to culture, not least of which are the anaerobic ones, the species that do not survive in the presence of oxygen. We now have anaerobic chambers and ways of culturing species without oxygen, but they didn't have that equipment back then. Mycobacterium leprae, that causes leprosy, resists culturing in the lab because it's an intracellular pathogen. And viruses obviously break the postulates too, as they also don't grow in pure culture, and they have to grow inside cells. If you're infecting a subject with a mixture of cells and bacteria rather than a pure culture, how can you prove what part of the mixture is causing the disease? It could be a reaction to the cells that you're growing the bacteria in rather than the bacteria themselves, for example. There are some bacteria that can be present but don't always cause disease, like for cholera or Helicobacter pylori, which can cause stomach ulcers and stomach cancer, but not in everyone all the time. Most people have some Clostridioides difficile in them, but it only causes disease in certain scenarios. Fun fact, C. diff is called difficile because difficile means difficult in French, and the organism is notoriously hard to culture in a lab. Koch was also the guy who proved that the bacteria Vibrio cholera causes the disease cholera and how to cure it, but that is a story for another episode. There are answers to these problems with the postulates that were developed after Koch published them. However, the postulates did form a very important base in an era where we were just beginning to accept that diseases were infectious at all. Koch was the first person to prove that the Bacillus anthracis was the cause of anthrax disease, the first time anyone had conclusively proven a bacteria caused any disease. It happened in 1876, and when he took his findings to the University of Breslau and presented them, Julius Cohnheim, who was a professor of pathological anatomy, said, "It leaves nothing more to be proved. I regard it as the greatest discovery ever made with bacteria, and I believe that this is not the last time that this young Robert Koch will surprise and shame us by the brilliance of his investigations." In the following years, Koch was given research space and funding, and he used the time to develop the basic foundations of modern bacteriological research. He invented glass microscope slides and cover slips, different methods of fixing and staining bacteria so we could see them, pouring solid culture media into these newly invented short-sided round glass dishes invented by his colleague R.J. Petrie. Petrie's dish, you might call them. Together, Koch and Petrie invented a gelatin beef broth that is the ancestor of modern agar culture plates on which we grow all kinds of things still. In the 1880s, Koch turned his sights to finding the cause of tuberculosis. He hadn't yet published his postulates officially, but he was using their principles to go about this. As with anthrax, people had proven that tuberculosis was infectious and could be spread animal to animal, but no one had yet isolated the microorganism responsible. Another long story short, see the sources for full details. On March 24, 1882, Koch announced at the Berlin Physiological Society that he had discovered the cause of consumption. At that meeting, it caused no real major sensation, but everyone was very interested. A couple weeks later, Koch published his discovery of Mycobacterium tuberculosis and named it as the cause of consumption. This was quickly translated and published around the world. It was called a turning point in our understanding and conquest of that deadly disease which had plagued mankind for millennia. Now, after this triumph, things go a little off the rails for Dr. Koch. Around this same time, Louis Pasteur was working in France on the attenuation or weakening of viruses. We attenuate a live virus so that it can't replicate or infect our cells, but is still whole and usually creates a better immune response to a vaccine. Koch and Pasteur, it turns out, were both gigantic, self-centered assholes. Koch was riding the high of proving the germ theory of disease and solving the cause of two of the worst pathogens of the day, and there was a lot of pressure on him. I don't know if it was entirely from outside forces or whether he just put this pressure on himself with his pride, but he made some comments disparaging Pasteur's work because Koch believed that the natural qualities of a bacterial species were unalterable, and Pasteur was working on attenuation, which could prove Koch wrong. Koch spoke German and Pasteur spoke French, and so they mainly beefed by publishing letters and editorials to each other in their own languages, and editors of opposing publications would translate and publish those letters for the other and everyone else to read. It got so bad that one editor commented the following: "The form which the dispute has taken is tinged with a certain acrimony, borrowed in part, perhaps, from the difference in nationalities, and in part from the difference in ages. Koch himself already acknowledges that the secret of splenic fever, i.e. anthrax, has been forced, and he now confesses that Pasteur must be credited with working out the attenuation of the active principle of disease ferments. In these respects, at least Pasteur is a genuine pathbreaker and has enabled Koch to make his own brilliant discovery of the Bacillus tuberculosis. There is work here for the time and energies and ingenuity of all interested in these questions, and there are still absolutely unknown regions in the domain of science for the bolder spirits who must always be in the vanguard and are impatient of a neighbor, however distant. There is no excuse here for the elbowing and crowding attendant upon long occupation." Basically, boys, calm down, there's enough undiscovered science here for everyone. Pasteur, for his part, was no innocent angel. After analysis of Pasteur's personal journals and lab notebooks, Patrice Debray called Pasteur unfair, arrogant, haughty, contemptuous, dogmatic, taciturn, individualist, authoritarian, careerist, flatterer, greedy, and ruthless with his opponents, and said that his authoritarianism, inflexible temperament, and his conflicting relationships with the students ended in the resignation of 73 students. This required the intervention of the Minister of Education and led to Pasteur's resignation. Debray also said, sometimes he gives the impression of merely checking the results described by others and then making them his own. One could also add that he was a misogynist. Koch does not come off much better. In 1885, Koch tried to establish a bacteriological institute in Germany, but was not successful, and Pasteur royally pissed him off by making one of his own in France in 1887. Koch spent a few years working. He discovered the cause and cure for cholera in this time, but for the most part he was rather quiet until 1890 when he announced he had a cure for tuberculosis. This was met with shock, but trust because of his past successes. He said his treatment could not be taken orally but had to be injected subcutaneously. This announcement took the world by storm. People started comparing him to literal Jesus Christ. The Lancet, a famous journal, published the news of his cure and called it, quote, glad tidings of great joy, which is a direct quote from the Bible used to announce the birth of Jesus. The English publication Review of Reviews compared his announcement to, quote, the news of the advent of Jesus of Nazareth in a Judean village. People were flocking to Berlin in droves to be treated, and people in America were being warned not to make the journey due to the crowds and the limited availability of the cure. And yet, Koch was so secretive about his methods and how he did this and what his cure was that people began to be suspicious. He described his cure, which he initially called lymph and then tuberculin, only as a brownish transparent fluid, and only under pressure in October 1891 did finally he divulged that it was a filtrate from a glycerin broth that he had grown some tuberculosis bacilli in. Other people were attempting to reproduce the cure, but were unable to do so. Koch was treating people with it, though, and it was starting to produce some severely negative reactions, and even some people were dying of it after experiencing delirium, coma, and chest pain. Given what we know about how he made this, those symptoms, and how he was injecting it under the skin, it was probably septic shock, which happens when the immune system reacts to massive amounts of bacterial lipids and cell components. The press quickly turned from calling him Jesus to publishing rude cartoons making fun of him. It got so bad that Koch resigned all his positions and took a government job as the director of the German Institute for Infectious Diseases. Not quite what he wanted, it didn't have his name on it, and he maintained the whole time that tuberculin was a cure, he just needed to purify it. In 1893, he had left his wife and become involved with and married an 18-year-old woman named Hedwig Freiberg. He was 50 at the time. The relationship seemed to comfort him, but on top of his failures around the TB cure, the press began roasting him over this too, with the New York Times calling him a deserted savant who had consoled himself from the fickleness of the public by running off with a dancer. Despite all of that, Koch was awarded the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine in 1905 for his discovery of Mycobacterium tuberculosis, which he accepted with Hedwig by his side. He died 5 years later in 1910, just a couple years after the Mantoux test to diagnose tuberculosis infection was developed based on the tuberculin injection that Koch had claimed was a cure. In fact, what he had really discovered was not a cure, but a method of diagnosis. We still use this test today. It's called either the tuberculin skin test, TST, or the Mantoux test, or the PPD, for purified protein derivative. Pasteur had more to contribute towards tuberculosis, even though it was not really his field of study. He had started off his career as a chemist, studying the shape of molecules and atoms. In the 1850s, a bunch of crusty white dudes were fighting against what they called the vitalist theory, which was the idea that living microorganisms were involved in fermentation, specifically in the beer and wine industry. Their thought was that fermentation was caused by chemical agents alone, which they called ferments. I mentioned that term a minute ago when I read that editorial comment on Koch and Pasteur's beef. In 1859, Félix Pouchet, who was director of the Natural History Museum in Rouen, said that he could bring about the spontaneous generation of life whenever he wished. And Pasteur was like, bet, and he performed what would go on to be a revolutionary scientific experiment where he disproved the spontaneous generation of life. This is where invoking the persona of Jesus Christ might have been more appropriate. Essentially, he boiled some broth in a glass flask with a long curving neck that would prevent bacteria or mold or yeast from the air from contaminating it once it was sterile. But the flask was not sealed, so air and oxygen could still flow. Nothing would grow in the flask unless the long necks were broken off and the air could settle directly into the broth. It was quite a big deal, and suffice to say that it made Pasteur kind of a big name in the world of science in general and in the field of fermentation, so much so that some local sugar beet farmers came to him for help. They were using their beets to produce alcohol and having trouble with their processes not working very well. Beer and wine were not really surviving long journeys particularly well at the time without spoiling. From 1860 to 64, Pasteur worked with the industry to develop a process of heating the beer and wine to between 60 to 100 degrees C, which is 140 to 212 Fahrenheit, and this protected the products from spoilage. By 1870, the process of pasteurization was employed by the Anheuser-Busch Brewery in the U.S., allowing them to transport their product from St. Louis to Texas and have it arrive unspoiled. Around the middle of the 1800s, most European societies were experiencing around 15 to 30% infant mortality in urban centers. Infectious diseases were on the rise due to the increase in crowding, the substandard housing, poor sanitation, lack of proper nutrition, and just a general lack of understanding of what caused disease. This is smack in the middle of the Industrial Revolution, and breastfeeding had declined by almost 70% because mothers were having to work long hours in factories, so babies were being fed with cow's milk instead. Dairy cow herds in the cities were often fed brewing slop, the leftover grain and yeasts from the brewing process. This made the cows prone to illness themselves, with many developing mouth ulcers, tuberculosis, and having their tails fall off. One brewery in Brooklyn experienced a 13% loss of their herd over a space of 10 weeks. The milk would smell nasty and bizarrely was tinged a light pale blue like this was Tatooine. To cover up this terrible quality, the milk would be adulterated with plaster of Paris, charcoal, starch, sugar, flour, really anything they could get their hands on to cover up the gross smell and taste. It also couldn't be transported very far due to the lack of refrigeration. The first person to use pasteurization on milk was Professor N.J. Fjord in Denmark in 1870, and the adaptation of the process quickly spread through Europe, but dairies in the U.S. were reluctant to spend money on the equipment, naturally. But something had to be done. One New York study showed that of 1,065 infant deaths due to diarrhea, 17% of infants were breastfed, 23% were fed a mix of breast milk and cow's milk, and 61% were fed exclusively cow's milk. Same thing in Liverpool. A study of 6,000 infant deaths showed that babies under 3 months old were 15 times more likely to die if they were fed only raw cow's milk versus breastfeeding. Major diseases even today caused by raw milk are typhoid, streptococcus, i.e. scarlet fever, diphtheria, and of course tuberculosis caused both by Mycobacterium tuberculosis and M. bovis, which causes cow tuberculosis. Although pasteurization didn't completely solve infant mortality naturally, it did greatly accelerate the declining rates of milk-borne diseases. Another factor that helped make milk healthier was the development of refrigerated transportation, which is a whole rabbit hole that I went down, but which I'm not going to bring up here because it's more about milk spoilage in general rather than about TB. But once insulated cold rail cars were developed using ice or later electricity, this played a factor in infant health too. Education in basic hygiene was a big factor, as well as the development of a public health nurse program to help train new mothers on hygiene and sanitation in the home. One major step that helped pasteurization become popular was the vocal support for it by Nathan and Lena Strauss, who, along with Nathan's brothers, owned Macy's department store in New York. Nathan and Lena were motivated to activism because they'd lost 2 of their children to milk-borne tuberculosis and were determined to bring pasteurization everywhere. They even subsidized the cost of providing pasteurized milk for disadvantaged children living in New York tenement districts. I think some modern billionaires and big business owners could take some notes from them. There were opponents to pasteurization even among physicians because they assumed that the heating process changed the nutritional value of the milk in some way. This, of course, is not true. Pasteurization does not change the content of the milk, but there will always be people who are against change because change can be scary.
How are you feeling today, Doc?
I'm dying. How are you?
Pretty much the same.
We know now that tuberculosis is usually caused by multiple different species grouped together into the Mycobacterium tuberculosis complex, or MTBC. You've got your Mycobacterium tuberculosis and bovis, but there are also Africanum, Microti, Caprae, and Cannedii species that can cause disease in humans. I'm going to take you through a little bit about the current biology and what we know now about this disease, but I'll keep it as top level as I can, as always. The Mycobacterium species are bacilli-shaped, so like a rod or a cocktail wiener shape instead of a ball, which is called a coccus shape. Feels like somebody got those backwards, but hey, what are you going to do? Mycobacteria are aerobic, meaning they use oxygen. They don't form spores like anthrax does. They are non-motile, so they do not move around like E. coli or Salmonella. MTB is very slow growing, which is a large part of why it's so hard to treat. And when I say slow growing, I mean one generation, one split of the cell, can take 20 to 24 hours, maybe as low as 16 in the lab under perfect conditions, whereas faster growing species like E. coli can double in as little as 20 minutes under those same ideal conditions. For reference, Staph aureus is a very common skin bacteria. It can also double in 20 minutes in the lab, the same with Salmonella typhi from earlier this season. Rickettsia prowazekii, the bacteria that causes typhus, also from episode 1, takes between 8 to 12 hours to divide. In the case of MTB, it can take 3 to 8 weeks to grow a culture in an incubator, while E. coli and most other species can show visible growth overnight or within a couple days at most. This means it's harder to diagnose in places that don't have access to molecular testing like PCR, because they're limited to trying to grow a culture to see if it's TB in the first place, and also harder to find out what antibiotics it's vulnerable to, which delays treatment. Slow growth time makes the bacteria harder to treat because some antibiotics work by inhibiting cell wall synthesis, which, if a cell is not dividing or is dividing very slowly, doesn't work, or also works slowly. Not only the cell wall, but DNA and protein synthesis have to happen for a cell to divide. But if it goes slowly, your body might eliminate the antibiotic before the process completes, so inhibition also isn't complete. During infection with tuberculosis, the first immune cells to respond are your macrophages, which are very important innate white blood cells. You've heard of them before in Season 1 in the Black Death and the Last of Us episodes, and earlier this season in the Typhus and Typhoid episode. Unsurprisingly, macrophages are one of the first lines of defense against infections, and Salmonella typhi, Rickettsia prowazekii, Yersinia pestis, and MTB can all survive inside of them. In the alveoli, which are the parts of your lungs where the oxygen and carbon dioxide are exchanged, the resident macrophages eat up all the bacteria and foreign particles that they encounter. This is a main part of how your body fights infection. From there, either the macrophages digest the bacteria and everything's fine, or the bacteria are able to escape some of the macrophages using specialized genes to help them survive. I'm not going to talk about which specific genes or get into those gritty details. This isn't that kind of show. In the case of TB, once the bacteria escape the macrophages, they will get into your lymphatic system where they travel to the lymph nodes and encounter T cells. T cells are your adaptive white blood cells that are the main strength of the immune system. They're like the Captain America of your white blood cells. Their job is to kill off infected cells, while B cells help activate the T cells, but they also produce antibodies, which makes them more like Iron Man with the Iron Legion and all his automatic AI-controlled drones. When the T cells become activated, they poke the B cells and say, hey, yo, look at this, let's go kick some ass. And then the T and the B cells head back to the lungs, they pick up some more macrophages and other white blood cells along the way. When they get there, everyone gathers around the infected macrophages and basically walls them off into what's called a granuloma. I will put a diagram in the show notes so you can see what I mean. As this immune response is going on, there are two ways it can end. If you have a very strong immune response, you will probably eliminate the bacteria or end up with a latent infection, a stalemate. But in approximately 10% of people, their immune response is not strong enough to do either of those things. 5% of those people will develop active TB within 2 years, and the other 5% will develop active infection at some point after that. Things that go into whether or not you will develop an active infection are the immune system weakening as you age, genetic conditions that result in an immunodeficiency, like infection with HIV, of course, malnutrition, diabetes, organ transplant, and rejection suppressing drugs, and prolonged corticosteroid use. Co-infection with HIV would only be an issue around the time that Heavenly Creatures takes place, which is the 1950s, but they wouldn't have been aware of its existence at the time, and I don't think it really would have been in New Zealand at that time either. The other movies all take place pre-1900, and HIV hadn't yet moved into humans. Inside the granuloma, you have a bunch of dead and dying white blood cells, as well as what are called lung parenchymal cells. Those are the ones on the surface of your alveoli that are responsible for the gas exchange when you breathe. Inside this mulch of dead cells is where the MTB bacteria live in relative dormancy. And inside there, it becomes like a goopy texture, and it's called the caseous center. And caseous means cheese-like, so you're welcome for that. Like I said, in most immunocompetent people, the granulomas contain the bacteria, and the battle between the immune system and the infection becomes a stalemate. If the bacteria escape the granulomas due to death of the surrounding tissue, this allows the bacteria to spread to other sections of the lungs and causes the coughing that spreads the disease. If the granuloma happens to be close to a blood vessel when it bursts and becomes a necrotic lesion, it can damage that blood vessel, which is why people cough up blood intermittently. The bacteria can also spread through the lymph and blood to other organs and spaces outside the lungs, which I mentioned before, and is called miliary tuberculosis. Having no symptoms doesn't always mean that the MTB you have is dormant, though. Some people will cycle through dormancy in periods of subclinical disease where the bacilli are active and spreading, just not in large enough numbers for the symptoms to be that noticeable. This is how Juliet was able to have TB as a kid, seemingly recover, and then her TB relapses as a teen and she's hospitalized again in Heavenly Creatures. How severe your symptoms are and whether or not you develop active TB is a spectrum, and on top of how your immune system responds, it depends a bit on how large a dose of bacteria you got during infection. But since fewer than 10 bacterial cells may be sufficient to cause disease, a big dose may not be that hard to receive. There's obviously a lot that I could go into specifically in terms of what constitutes a, quote, strong immune response, but to really get into that would take a lot more microbiology and immunology jargon and discussion than I typically like to get into on this show. My main purpose for doing this is to make it all accessible to people without a background in 3 degrees in science. However, there are a few things I want to mention. Something called interferon gamma is key to the macrophage's defense against MTB. Interferon gamma is a very important chemical messenger for the entire immune system, but it particularly activates macrophages, and it works with vitamin D to enhance the killing of MTB inside the macrophage. This is where your nutritional deficiencies come into play. If you don't have enough vitamin D, then your defense to MTB will be weaker. That is why sunbathing at sanatoria was actually effective. Since 1996, 11 genes connected to 21 different genetic disorders regarding interferon gamma have been identified that result in increased susceptibility to mycobacterial diseases like tuberculosis and leprosy, or it's called Hansen's disease nowadays. Most of those genetic disorders result in not enough interferon gamma being produced. Reactive oxygen species are also important factors in your immune defense, and those are things like hydrogen peroxide, superoxide, which is O2-, hydroxide, which is OH-, or singlet oxygen. They are incredibly reactive because oxygen does not like having a charge or being on its own as a single atom, so it will violently attack whatever it can, rip off its electrons, and steal them so that it is more stable. When this happens in our regular cells, that is called oxidative stress, and it is not good because then it damages our own cells. But when it happens to pathogens, it is very, very good, and we like it. Like I said, there is a lot more to all of this. I have linked a paper called Immune Response to Mycobacterium Tuberculosis if you are interested and want to learn more, but it is very dense on the genetics talk. I mentioned briefly last season in the Last of Us episode, there is a small number of people who seem to be more resistant to developing tuberculosis. These people have more of a white blood cell called the natural killer, or NK cells, that express a certain receptor that is much more commonly found on cytotoxic T cells. This receptor is the CD8 protein, and that is the characteristic receptor of the cytotoxic T cells. We typically just call them CD8 T cells because it is so diagnostic. But natural killer cells are very closely related to CD8 T cells, and so they do sometimes express it. This extra receptor helps the NK cells respond better to the chemical messages that the cells are sending to each other, and this enhances their killing abilities. Loss of this CD8 expression on NK cells is associated with HIV progression to AIDS, relapsing multiple sclerosis, recurrence of leukemias, and now a progression to active tuberculosis. So this is a really cool discovery. It's fairly new. The paper I have just came out in spring of 2025, and there is a lot of potential here for research into exploiting this.
I will take her to the hospital.
Where is your child?
Out of all of the ridiculous treatments that I described earlier, only 4 things have ever helped in the preventing the spread of tuberculosis. First, the sanatorium movement, coupled with local laws and ordinances to improve sanitation and slum housing. Second, pasteurization of cow's milk to reduce milk-borne TB and other diseases as a bonus. Then in 1908, a vaccine was discovered/invented, which we still use today. And finally, the dawning of the antibiotics era came for TB in 1947 when streptomycin was found to be effective. I say vaccine, but don't get too excited because it's complicated. Creating a vaccine to a bacteria is much more involved than for a virus because, to put it simply, a bacteria is alive and a virus is not. Bacteria usually have bigger genomes that can code for more ways to disguise themselves from your immune response. Because this episode is so long already, though, and most of this happened after the time periods in which our movies take place, I'm going to skim through this a little fast. Around 1900, Albert Calmette and Camille Guérin were researching a tuberculosis vaccine at the Pasteur Institute in Lille. I'm sure Koch was big mad about that. They were growing tuberculosis in a pure culture, following Koch's postulates, but they were finding that the bacteria would clump together, and this made their solution not homogeneous, and so dosing and plating new cultures and all of that wouldn't be consistent if the bacteria was not evenly distributed. For that, they experimented with different ways to reduce clumping, and they found that adding ox bile helped with it, but as an added bonus, it produced a strain of bacteria that was not virulent. They began culturing this strain in a liquid medium of bile, glycerin, and potato starch, and they were splitting it every 3 weeks because, as we know, MTB grows very slowly. They managed to keep going through World War I, even though this was dangerous and supplies were very hard to come by. But by 1919, they had performed 230 subculturings and produced a strain of MTB that did not cause tuberculosis in test animals. Guérin suggested naming it Bacille Calmette Guérin, and now we call it BCG, which I'm going to use from now on because I'm bad at pronouncing French names. In 1921, the first human trials began in France. In July that year, a woman at the Charité Hospital in Paris died of tuberculosis only hours after giving birth to a healthy baby, so the doctors decided to vaccinate the infant. In all the papers I read, I didn't see anything explicit about who decided this was okay or whether the infant was an orphan, so the doctors just used it as a guinea pig. But considering the time period, I think either option is equally likely. So just imagine there's a problematic consent alarm going off right now. They gave the vaccine orally because they wrongly thought that TB was transmitted that way. After 6 months of monitoring and several follow-up doses, the infant was quite fine, and so the vaccination program there was gradually expanded to other infants born at the same hospital. The 2 doctors, Weil, Hallet, and Turpin, tried out subcutaneous vaccination too, but this route can produce some rather gnarly local reactions, and the parents objected to the way it looked, so they stopped trying that. I've got some pictures in the show notes as always. They're pretty gross though, so just be warned. From 1924 to 1928, 114,000 infants were vaccinated without many serious complications, and follow-up with these infants showed that they were much less likely to get tuberculosis than those who were not vaccinated. In 1930, though, we have a bit of a disaster. In the town of Lübeck in Germany, Professor Deke, the director of Lübeck General Hospital, started a vaccination program using a strain of BCG obtained from the Pasteur Institute. After 4 to 6 weeks, a huge number of infants in the trial were coming down with TB. Of 250 that were vaccinated, 73 had died, 135 had contracted TB, leaving just 42 who were unharmed. This was a huge problem, as you can imagine. The trial was immediately stopped and the government started an inquiry. After almost 2 years of investigating, it was found that after the Lübeck hospital received the BCG from the Pasteur Institute, it was contaminated by a virulent strain of regular TB by some doctors at the hospital. 2 of them went to prison for this mistake. News of this spread, and even though the cause was known, it shattered confidence in the vaccine, because how can you be sure then that your vaccine wasn't contaminated? Research continued, and in the 40s and 50s, there were trials happening around the world. Several studies had shown that the BCG vaccine was effective in protecting children from miliary TB, the disseminated around the full body TB that I mentioned, and UNICEF, the brand new WHO, and the Scandinavian Red Cross societies were all recommending vaccination. There was a UK study that showed strong evidence for support, but a US-based one produced mixed results. It's thought that this was because the US one was tested on a different strain from a different lab than the UK one, but also because there appears to be more environmental mycobacteria in places like Alabama, Georgia, and Puerto Rico where the US vaccine was tested. If people have passively encountered mycobacteria, even if they don't react to the tuberculin skin test, then any change in immune response they might show could be reduced, meaning the vaccine trial results won't seem as impressive. The US trial isn't the only one with mixed results, though. There was a big one in India in 1968 that also produced uncertain results that have never actually been fully released, so we'll never know what happened there. There's a ton of variation in response based on what strain of the BCG is used. There are 5 or 6 common ones, but one 1995 meta-analysis saw that overall, most studies showed that vaccinating newborns reduces their risk of developing TB by more than 50%. However, as striking as the results in children are, the vaccine does basically nothing in adults, and we don't really know why. Even in children, though, the biggest benefit is in preventing what is called miliary tuberculosis, as I mentioned. That is the term for when tuberculosis spreads to your kidneys, your bones, etc. And it also helps in reducing tuberculosis meningitis. It doesn't necessarily prevent TB infection outright, and the protection it does provide wanes after a few years, but it does help with reducing overall tuberculosis mortality. In adults, the vaccine does not provide significant protection at all, and prior vaccination can produce false positives of the tuberculin skin test. Maybe this lack of adult protection has something to do with the environmental mycobacteria exposure. Perhaps it's that by adulthood, most people have encountered TB and are latently infected in the areas where they've tested the vaccine. There's a bunch of research going into this, though, which is good news, but there's just not enough funding. In terms of treatment, it's an even more complicated story than vaccination. Effective treatments for TB were discovered in the 1940s. The first antibiotic, salvarsan, was discovered in about 1910 by Paul Ehrlich, and this was an arsenic compound and it was used to treat syphilis. Penicillin was discovered in 1929, but not used medically until 1940, and sulfonamides came about in the 1930s. Unfortunately, penicillin and sulfa drugs are not effective against tuberculosis. One drug called Promin, which was sodium glucose sulfate, proved effective against leprosy but not tuberculosis. However, the people who discovered this, H. Corwin Hinshaw and Hugh Feldman, they had heard about a drug called streptomycin that was reported on in 1944. They requested some samples of it and they tested it against guinea pigs with tuberculosis, and they found impressive results. That same year, which was 1944, Jörgen Lehmann in Gothenburg, Sweden, found a chemical agent called para-aminosalicylic acid, PAS, that had some effectiveness in treating TB also. Unfortunately, resistance to these 2 drugs developed almost immediately. In 1951, isoniazid was discovered by 3 different groups almost simultaneously. Resistance to this also quickly developed. So Heavenly Creatures takes place in 1952, 53, and 54, and the main character, Juliet, played by Kate Winslet, has TB. She had TB as a child during World War II. She recovered in a hospital, but since that would have been around 1943 to 44, I doubt that her recovery then included streptomycin, so her infection probably just became dormant. It does come back later in the movie. The symptoms are shown pretty accurately, and again, Juliet goes into hospital, this time in 1953. So streptomycin and isoniazid would have been invented, although her treatment is not talked about, so I'm not sure if she would have gotten these drugs, or if the resistance would have made them useless by that time. The British Medical Research Council did a study showing that using multiple drugs to treat tuberculosis at the same time is the best course of action, and so triple therapy was created. Oral isoniazid and PAS for 18 to 24 months, plus intramuscular streptomycin injections for the first 6 months was the treatment standard for about 15 years. Rifampin was first used in 1966, and the combination of rifampin, isoniazid, and ethambutol together allowed treatment to be reduced to just 9 months. Pyrazinamide was discovered in the late 40s, and then low doses of that, along with isoniazid and rifampin, could reduce treatment to 6 months. Currently, as of 2022, the recommended course is 8 weeks of daily isoniazid, rifapentine, pyrazinamide, and moxifloxacin, followed by 9 weeks of the same but without the pyrazinamide. For drug-resistant strains, treatment can still last 18 to 21 months, and which specific drugs depends on the strain, and that combo can change over the course of the treatment too. The good news is that after a month or two of treatment, most people feel like new and can be released from hospitals. This is what led to a decline of the popularity and the eventual closure of sanatorium. However, the bad news is that because of the long treatment regimens and because most people start to feel better, people tend to stop taking the drugs for the full prescribed length of time. Because of this, as many different antibiotic and drug combos out there are to treat it, there are strains of bacteria that are resistant to that combo, which is why testing for which resistance a person's particular TB has is so critical. Treatment is not without side effects and problems. Things like hepatitis, nerve damage that affects sensation and movement, blindness, rash, renal dysfunction, GI upset, muscle and joint pains, anxiety, confusion and psychosis, hypoglycemia, and tendinitis are common. TB tends to suppress appetites, as I've said, and a few weeks into treatment, when you start feeling better, that hunger comes back with a feral vengeance. This is where socioeconomic factors begin to affect your treatment. Even in places where the cost of the drugs is free, the cost of traveling to a clinic to get your meds is not. And in most cases, to ensure you're actually taking the drugs, most hospitals and clinics will require you to go there every day to take your doses. In low-income countries, people may have to travel for hours to get to the nearest clinic, and this costs money in transport and lost work. The excessive hunger during treatment is difficult because people already can't afford food, so the increased appetite is almost unbearable. The interplay of wanting to be cured, knowing that TB will kill you if you don't finish your treatment, but also knowing that the treatments may cause permanent side effects and that you're going to feel like you're starving to death the entire time, it can be very hard for people to complete their course of treatment for months to years on end. I am not giving as much detail as I would like to be able to do for this, but short of reading all of Everything is Tuberculosis to you, I would not be able to give you as effective a picture as John Green did in that book. There is so much more I could say about treatment and the current state of TB. I started off this episode with the startling facts that even though we do have these effective cures, there are still over 1 million deaths globally every year from this disease. If someone can complete their full treatment, cure rates can be higher than 95%, even about 76% cure rates for people with HIV, and about 60% for people with multi-drug resistance. Those are good numbers, but the problem is getting people the drugs, getting them food, and continuously doing this consistently for up to 2 years. That is, unfortunately, not possible for millions of people around the world, and it is shameful to every single global government and billionaire that wakes up every day and allows this to happen. We don't have to live in a world where illnesses only exist because of poverty, but we do, and that is a deliberate choice that billionaires and governments make. I was going to end the show here and move on to rate the movies, but I am editing this in just before recording because 2 days ago, on November 13th, 2025, a tuberculosis outbreak was announced in my city's unhoused population. I live in Edmonton, Alberta, and the outbreak was apparently known about last month, and they waited to get some results back before announcing it. 12 cases have been diagnosed so far this year within the city's unhoused population. That may not seem like much when looking at the number on its own, but I hope that now, after listening to this episode, you see how vitally important it is to diagnose, treat, and prevent this illness from spreading before it gets out of hand. To everyone out there not caring about it because this is within the unhoused people and you think you're insulated because you don't go to shelters or you cross the road rather than walk by the homeless people and you drive your car everywhere rather than take transit. Have you considered that the people who are not unhoused work in the shelters and spend time with the unhoused people through social services and will be exposed to this and that they can catch it and transmit it to you in a grocery store or coffee shop? Have you considered that you can't always tell if a person is unhoused by looking at them and you likely walk past some in the street all the time without knowing? Or that the unhoused interact with other low-income people who are housed through accessing social services and soup kitchens and food banks, and that the infection can spread that way, and it goes on and on and on. One cough, one sneeze. That's all it takes. For all the people commenting on this story online that I see saying, oh, but it's easily treatable with antibiotics. Easily? It's treatable, sure, but I've just gone through a massive list of side effects, including blindness, that comes with TB treatment. You with your stable job and your healthcare and your benefits that gives you reliable, free, or cheap access to treatment programs and your access to clean drinking water to take pills every day and your healthy food to keep you nourished during treatment and not nauseous and vomiting and your lack of mental health or addiction struggles that can sometimes make simply not killing yourself every day the only accomplishment that you can muster. Imagine taking all that away, being told you have to take daily pills for at minimum 6 to 9 months, when you might already be struggling to take medications to help you with your other issues, including potentially other chronic health conditions. And TB treatment makes you feel like ass on top of all the complications of all the other meds you might be on or addictions that you might be struggling with. And being part of one of the most reviled and hated demographics of society where people say some of the most horrific things about you and out loud say things like they wish the government would round you up and lock you all away, or even saying that they wouldn't care if you died. This is a time for empathy, compassion, and action, not NIMBYism and ignorance. Before I rate the movies, I want to leave you with a quote that is 33 years old and still relevant literally today. This is from a paper published in 1992 called Tuberculosis: Commentary on a Reemergent Killer. At the time, there was a very bad outbreak of TB happening in New York City amongst their poor and unhoused individuals, and it was not being addressed adequately. In the world of infectious diseases, there is nothing from which we are remote and no one from whom we are disconnected. We will continue to be challenged by emergent threats to health, new agents and vectors, and new evolutionarily selected and man-made variants. The United States spends 12% of its gross national product on healthcare, although one wonders how much is spent to prevent disease rather than to treat it. We know how to cure and prevent conventional TB. We must quickly develop the capacity to prevent the spread of drug-resistant TB. If we do not learn from the current epidemic of TB, and if we do not develop new scientific tools to diagnose, prevent, and treat the disease, the tragedy unfolding in New York City or Edmonton could be repeated in any city in America or anywhere that has homeless people, AIDS, prisons, hospitals, and nursing homes. The fundamental principle of infectious disease control that we have yet to apprehend was best articulated in 1513, not by a physician, but by the political scientist Machiavelli. It happens then as it does to physicians in the treatment of consumption, which in the commencement is easy to cure and difficult to understand. But when it has neither been discovered in due time nor treated upon a proper principle, it becomes easy to understand and difficult to cure. The same thing happens in state affairs. By foreseeing them at a distance, which is done only by men of talents, the evils which might arise from them are soon cured. But when, from want of foresight, they are suffered to increase to such a height that they are perceptible to everyone, there is no longer any remedy. Overall, I'm going to rate Tombstone a solid 9 out of 10. Apparently the historical accuracy was high as well as the way that tuberculosis was portrayed by Val Kilmer, who played Doc Holliday. Moulin Rouge and Les Mis, while they got the symptoms correct, I'm going to say their portrayals of disease strayed more into the romantic ideas about tuberculosis, but these are period pieces and this is historically an accurate attitude, so Moulin Rouge gets 8 out of 10 and Les Mis gets 6 out of 10 test tubes. Heavenly Creatures did really well. It's a good movie about a true story, so go back and check that one out. I guess 9 out of 10 for them. And that is all I have for this episode and this season. Thank you so much for being here, for listening, and letting me info dump about my special interest to you. I thank, again, my family and my friends and my cat and everyone who supported me. I am a researcher and not a doctor, so please don't take any of this as medical advice. It is for entertainment only. You can find me on Facebook, TikTok, Blue Sky, Instagram, all of those at Tierah Ruins Things. And you can find all kinds of things at Tierah Ruins Things on Substack, like the show notes and a transcript for every episode. Also on Substack, you can support me ruining things by becoming a paid subscriber. Or if you like Patreon, I'm there too. If that place is more your vibe, there are some cool options for pledge tiers I set up, so go check them out. With either of those subscriptions, you'll also get access to upcoming bonus episodes that I have planned, future Q&A sessions where I answer your submitted questions, and all kinds of things. I do all the research writing, recording, and editing. The new theme song this season was written and provided by I Effigy, and you can follow them on Spotify at the link that I post. If you have any suggestions for future TV shows or movies featuring diseases or pathogens that you want me to cover, or questions you want me to answer, send them to tierahruinsthings@gmail.com or get in touch on any of the social medias I mentioned. That is all for this season, and I will see you next time.